Hi everyone, welcome to the 50 millionth Hangout on Community Manager Appreciation Day, an epic, extraordinary event organised by the amazing team at My Community Manager. It's such a pleasure to be here. As you can probably tell from my accent, we've now flipped over to the other side of the world. It's that late. So my name is Vanessa Paik. I'm Head of Community and Content at a company called REA Group here in Australia. I'm also one of the founders of Swarm Conference, which is Australia's national conference for community managers and community practitioners. And I have some amazing friends and colleagues here on a panel today to chat about what I think is a really important question that often comes before a lot of the other stuff that we like to talk about, and that is, how do you tell if your business or organisation, whatever it might be, is actually ready to take on community? Communities have become increasingly popular over the years as people have started to see the kinds of successes they can produce from a profitability perspective, from an efficiencies perspective, from a relationship building perspective, and everything in between. But a lot of people set down that road without necessarily doing the legwork in terms of, is it actually right for the business? How does it align with business strategy and objectives, which of course then leads you into questions about how you're going to measure those objectives and the life of the community. So to unpack all of that today, we have some fantastic panelists. I will go around and let everybody introduce themselves. Why don't we start with you, Hugh?
Hello everyone, I'm also an Australian, so good to speak to everyone across the world, and I appreciate the time zone differences because we get them on our end too. I work at a company called Dialogue Group, who mostly run Dialogue Consulting, which is a consultancy specialising in social. And so we give a lot of advice around strategy and risk management and how people are really going to decide whether they're really prepared for community. So yeah, look forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Hugh. Over to you, lovely Jess.
Sorry, my mic was muted. Hi, I'm Jessica. I am based in Austin, Texas, so the other side of the Pacific Ocean. And I'm a community manager by day, and I also blog. I've also run a blog for the last 5 years, so which you can check out at jessicanomic.com, or just find me on Twitter at jessicanomic. And I'm super excited to talk community.
Awesome. Do we have you there, Jules? No, I think Jules has gone on temporary hiatus. That's okay. How about we move on to the lovely Scott Moore?
So I'm not Justin. So for those of you who are tuning in for him, I apologize. Justin is doing good work. Justin got called in to the New York Red Cross to volunteer to help folks out. So my connection is he and I both operate under as community consultant partners in the communal group. So I have about 20 years of online community building and management experience, and have started several communities. So virtual worlds, for-profits, non-profits, and have gone through these kinds of questions. So I'm looking forward to this. I just jumped in, so it's like, awesome, let's go.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. And yeah, a huge thanks to Scott for stepping up at the last minute to fill the shoes of Mr. Isaf, who was off doing good in the world in more ways. Stuck in. Hopefully you will have had a chance to live today. I really talk about for an hour in and of itself, which is, how does an organisation know that it's ready for community? What kind of signals should it be looking for, flags, criteria? Is there a litmus test that it can apply so that when somebody walks in and says, I know, let's build an online community, everybody can take a breath and go through a systematic process to assess whether that's in fact the right decision for the business and for the targets of said community? Who wants to jump in?
Sorry, that's right, I'll jump in. I'll save you, Vanessa. So look, I mean, I think it's really hard, and I think it's quite difficult now that there is a lot of rhetoric around about how everything needs to be, community first and social media first, and everything should start with some sense of community. And so I think it can be very, very difficult for a lot of businesses and organisations these days who feel almost pressured that they have to jump in. And I think sometimes, you know, and I think maybe obviously the topic of this is really that question of we need to, as, you know, community practitioners, I guess, you know, we need to also make sure that, you know, we can stand up and say, no, you know, you're not ready for community. And that might be because, you know, if I was an FMCG brand or things like that, you know, consumers might not want to be part of a community to talk about, you know, that particular brand. There might not actually be the desire within that target audience to join some kind of community, sometimes online or offline, to talk about the brand. Or alternatively, on the other side, the organisation itself might not be ready to adopt that kind of thing. So are they really ready to actually have these kinds of new processes and let go of that sense of brand a little bit? And then obviously, you know, there's some technical pieces in there as well. But oftentimes I feel that, you know, it's either the scenario where the brand internally hasn't quite sort of gotten its things in order from the point of view of the processes and the change management internally required, or alternatively, sometimes we've just forgotten that we can launch these amazing, technologically wonderful platforms that people don't actually want to, you know, people don't actually want to engage through that channel.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Okay. I'll go ahead. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think trying to create a community just because you think you have to, or because your competitors are doing it, or you're being told like, oh, we want to increase our follower counts or whatever, is generally a really bad way to start a community. Start a community because it's going to fulfill a business need. Like, it's going to fulfill a goal. It's going to hit a goal or an objective or a need that your business wants to fulfill, whether that's something when it comes to like customer support or marketing or brand awareness. Make sure you tie into that one objective, and make sure that that's the reason that they're starting a community, and you're not trying to start a community just for the sake of you think you should have one.
So I'll add to first I'll add part of what Hugh alluded to, and that is, I think there's a conversation that has to go on with an organization where you say, do you have any idea what you're about to get into? And you have to let them know. It's like, are you open to this kind of feedback? Are you open to change? Are you open to people having conversations about you that may not be, you know, that are in your house, so to speak, but they're not necessarily all lightness and sunshine. I think that's one aspect that the community needs, or that the organization needs to think about. I take a little bit more of a older view of what community is, and that is trusted relationships between people. And I think this is the question: why do you think you need a community? Who is going to be in the community? Who are the people who, and what are they going to be interacting with each other about? Are they talking to each other? Are they trading information? Are they buying and selling things to each other? And then how are you actually going to help them be successful at that particular transaction between them? And again, it goes back to the purpose of the community. Are you helping a community or a group of people help them fulfill their needs? Otherwise, you may need something a little bit different, like marketing campaigns, or you know, it might be
evil marketing.
Yeah, no, not evil marketing, but it's different. Your focus is different, and so I think that having that understanding is: does that community already exist? Are the people who you think you want to build a community out of, are they already talking to each other, or maybe they haven't talked to each other, but you have to do some research and find out, do they want to talk to each other, but they just haven't been able to, and now you're going to help them provide a space, or you're going to help organize them around something, and then they will talk to each other. I think this is a great, this is an example. CMAD was an idea that Jeremiah Alwang throws out there, but over the past couple of years, Brew and Sherry and other folks have gathered around that and really done something with it, and they're providing the space. We're already talking to each other. We were already talking to each other on Community Management Appreciation Day. this was something that was functional that they put together. So clearly they understood they were ready for something of this magnitude to go 24 hours. I'll stop.
Yep. No, that's fantastic. I'll just pause a brief moment just to welcome Julie Delaforce back after some technical difficulties. I'll just finish off the point, and then we'll get Jules, you to introduce yourself as well. I think you all covered that fantastically. I don't really have much to add. Suffice to say that I think that you're absolutely right. So the role of the role of us as community advocates and community thinkers and builders within our respective organisations is not just to do the implementation piece and to be the service deliverer. Obviously, it's to consult and to make strategic recommendations. And sometimes those recommendations are going to be, you know what, you're not ready. We haven't done these steps. Or, as you just said, Scott, we haven't gone through this really critical piece of work that looks at, now that we know who we want to talk to, where are they already talking, what existing communities are already out there, and where are the gaps that we might potentially be able to fill, be that functionally or from a content capacity, or exactly what node do we operate as within that little ecosystem. And and it's usually, or I'd say often not the host entity. Sometimes it absolutely is, and that makes the most sense, but it's not always. And I think that we don't sort of do that mapping piece to figure out where the people are, where we fit within the existing networks and clusters of relationships before we start. I also think that it's helpful to introduce our organisations to the fact that there are different models of community. Obviously, community means something different to everybody anyway, so I think that kind of equalising the understanding of that term and normalising that within our organisation is another good first step, so that when the CEO says community, we know what they mean, and when the customer service operator says community, we know what they mean, and when we say community, we're all on the same page, and we can identify that there are different ways to meet those goals once we have identified what they are. Maybe one of them is an own community. It might be forums, it might be a virtual world, it might be a Q&A platform, it might be some social media extension, it might be a combination of. They can all potentially foster and cultivate and function as communities for us, but that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. I think that, in my experience, that often gets lost, particularly in the world of large corporates who look to their peers who often do things in a similar way, and as you said before, Jess, kind of think, those guys are doing it, so we better do the same thing, and they just look to cut and paste the model without actually interrogating whether it's the right model for them. Jules, do you want to introduce yourself before I start talking anymore?
I apologise for my late arrival. My name is Julie. I am the General Manager at Quip. We are Australian-based, probably tell by the accent, and we are online community and social media specialists.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Did you have anything you wanted to add, Jules, before we moved on, just on that first question about the thinking process involved in even answering the question, how do you know if you're ready for a community?
Yeah, I just think you need to, I mean, for me it always comes back to the objective, and can that be achieved through online community? So, you can't do anything and everything, so you've got to align that with your business. Also having the right resourcing and tools as well. If you don't have the money to build the community, you're not going to spend anything, you're going to use free forums, then you probably don't have the money for a community manager as well and the right tools to be using. So just to assess, what you want to do and how you're going to do it, and if the community's the right fit.
And there's one other thing I would add, which I think you all basically touched on, which is in terms of aligning the objectives. I've read a blog post on this recently. It's many of us have written blog posts to this effect, which is that if you can't really honestly say that, meeting your own objectives in some way overlaps and overlays with the objectives of your community, then I would seriously look inward and ask if community is for you. I've seen a lot of organisations go for a planning process that's actually reasonably well thought out, even to the extent of prepping a community roadmap, but ultimately what they wanted to accomplish was so dissonant and so divergent from what the actual community they were trying to build wanted to accomplish that it sort of ended in tears. So I think that there needs to be not necessarily a complete match. If that happens, that's wonderful. And it does happen in organisations where community really is the bedrock of the organisation, but there has to be enough of an overlap that your success is at least partially equivalent to the community's success and vice versa. So they're all in the same game and that everybody's out to win. I think that if success looks too different for each of those groups, then that's when you can run into trouble. I guess, given that, what are the top mistakes that you guys see in all of your collective years of experience that organisations and businesses are making when they think, yep, let's build a community? What are the absolute top crop of mistakes that they make right out of the gate? And how can we help them avoid those mistakes?
For me, I think one of the bigger ones that you see often is just not looking for quick wins. So thinking, oh, I'll build an online community and everyone will come and be there on day one and it'll be fabulous. So understanding that it takes a bit of time and effort. And it's, yeah, it's, I guess, sort of that misunderstanding that social media and online community are the same. So sort of thinking that, oh, I'll just put the, you know, big ad budget behind it. So not looking at sustainable growth as well. So then people, of course, think, oh, yeah, online community doesn't work because I tried it.
And you get that lovely hockey stick graph.
Yeah. I'd add one on the other end, sometimes growing too fast or growing too broadly can be a problem that organizations can get into. They market their community, they've got everything set up, they've got the right pieces, but they're not targeting their community. Actually, I'll give you a slightly, or they're targeting the wrong part of the community. One thing that I have encountered, especially in Q&A style communities, is they focus on the people who need answers to questions and not on the people who are actually providing the answers. And so I've seen this across in any kind of community where there's going to be a mutual support, and it can be health, technical, professional. You have to be able to get the experts in who are willing to take the time with novices to actually provide the answers. And so often what you have is you have these large communities of people who there are just no experts there, and then they're not really providing good answers. And so then again, they'll turn and they'll say, well, this is a failure, or they'll try to wrench it into something else that it's not. So that's one thing that's a danger.
Smart point, Scott. I've seen that play out in a few communities I've worked on over the years where in one particular case study, we had an incredibly large community, actually very successful. It had the right mix of sort of conviviality and sort of, you know, in the margins conversations, and those were the experts, and they kind of hung around and they answered the questions, and there was, at the time, enough investment in their needs for them to be sustained to do that. At a certain point, the business decided it didn't want the quote-unquote off-topic conversation. So, and in doing so, actually managed to carve out the primary reason for being that most of the experts were there. And then wondered why over time that expert participation started to drop off, and they had a community that was still superficially active but was just full of newcomers kind of wandering around going, why isn't anybody helping me? So I think that's really, really important. I think in the rush to focus on outcomes, which we do know really matter, and we've just all said really matter, you still got to remember that the relationships and the personalities driving those outcomes are a key part of what makes this work and this modelling work, as opposed to a different kind of business solution.
Yeah, and I guess the thing that I wanted to add there was also the question of, and this probably ties into the next thing, was also the question of, are you actually following, are you following the right metrics? Are the metrics you're following, do they make sense in the context of what it is that you're trying to achieve? Because one of the things I think is very easy for people to do, and obviously every business likes to have 3 or 4 key metrics that they can just follow sort of almost blindly into the dust. But unless those metrics actually have meaning to the business, you can end up going, okay, well, let's look at page views of our community, and you go, okay, well, what does that mean? Because inevitably, if you do that, you end up in a scenario, maybe months, maybe years down the track, where someone all of a sudden goes, well, but is this thing where we've been following page views for the last year, is that actually producing any value to us? Or they'll go, oh, let's do this because that means more page views. And that doesn't actually line up with, I guess, that underlying strategy and that core reason that people are there and using the platform. So I think really aligning that idea of what are the metrics that we should be using and how do they actually align with our business needs and our business outcomes is really important, both in that planning stage and then also as time goes on.
Jess, what do you reckon?
I couldn't agree more with what you and everyone has said, but I'd just add into it, not to mention just like when you're getting your community ready to launch, make sure you have the resources available to be there. The worst thing that you could possibly do is have this massive influx of people to join your community and nobody's getting any responses or being acknowledged at all because you have this flood of people and it turns into a ghost town that, like a couple of others have said, where it ends up being a whole bunch of people posting and nothing ends up happening. And the fastest way to keep that, the fastest way to lose any momentum is to have a community that turns into a ghost town. And ideally, having those responses within a matter of hours, if not minutes, is ideal. And to add on to that, one other point I would add to that as well is making sure that the team of people that you have prepared to staff and run your community have the autonomy from internally to be able to make those decisions, to be able to make some decisions and some replies and messages on the fly. Yes, yes, mistakes happen. I've seen it happen in the communities I've run. Everybody's going to make a mistake. Generally speaking, they're much easier to respond fast and give something that's a good response. That's give something when you have the trust in people to give the right responses, than to delay everything and making your messages go through five layers of approval, and that could include PR, legal. Yes, there's a time and place for that, but ultimately, when you're dealing with an online community, and especially on the social media side, you don't generally want to wait 48 hours to respond to a crisis.
Yes, at that point, it's probably front page news if it's bad enough.
Exactly. Hopefully, it's not that bad.
I'd like to add to something, the flip side of what Hugh said, which was focusing on business metric or having business metrics as part of your community success metrics is important. There's a point where you can take it too far if you focus mostly or only on the business metrics and you forget that there is community. The community itself has its own success. I'll give you a really quick example. Working with a Q&A Q&A site, and they made their money pretty much off of ad revenue. So page views were money, one-to-one correspondence. And the problem was if you asked a question, or if you came to the website seeking an answer to a question and you didn't get the answer to your question, you would click on another page, which of course generates more page views. So the logical conclusion of this would be there will be no answers on the page, because the more I can get you to click around on pages, the more money I actually make. And there was a tension that had to be balanced between we don't want to just, we actually have to provide answers, otherwise we don't have a service. The community needs to be able to have this. So sometimes hyper-focusing on certain metrics, there's a balance between where the success is, and you have to make that balance. If you focus only on the business metrics, sometimes you can get yourself into deep trouble and undermine your community.
Yeah, no, I think that's really true, and I think that it's definitely the challenge. And I mean, that's the classic example of the community where, I guess almost like, God forbid, bringing Facebook into this, but where the idea obviously is people coming together in these almost self-organizing groups of friends and Facebook groups and pages and everything else. But ultimately, Facebook, the entity, just wants to drive page views, and so inevitably at some point, as you said in that example, inevitably at some point those two things will come to a head, and what comes out the other side kind of depends on whether the organization or how the organization values that community. relative to it as, I guess, just a core income stream. I know I'm in trouble because I use the word Facebook now. But it is, I think it is a very good example of where, we are heading towards this scenario where a lot of communities, and particularly a number of startups, see a community as almost an eventually monetizable thing if they can get, if they can drive enough page views or if they're in enough of a niche audience. And that's not really a reason to create a community. It's not really any more a unique kind of thing to, I guess, specialize in. Is we want to produce something so it gets lots of page views. I'm not sure that's a really great business model. But there is always inevitably down the track with those kinds of business models, and this happens time and time again, whether you're talking about Facebook or many of the older forums and online communities, where inevitably there comes that awkward sort of head-on collision between the business role of we want lots and lots of page views, so therefore we want the community to get as big as possible, and the same thing happens in startups when you look at we want to get lots and lots of users so that we can cash out for lots and lots of dollars. But equally, the community isn't necessarily built to withstand that kind of growth or withstand that kind of level of traffic or questions or whatever it might be, and so it actually does need to be a slower burn than sort of the hockey stick model.
I think this is a really important point that you both have raised, actually, because I think that, as community builders and strategists, all of us are talking in this hangout about building, generally longitudinal, sustainable communities over time, and as the ideal vision, presumably, that's going to generate optimal outcomes for the business and for those community members. I think it's, as we all know from working within various companies and organizations, these things can change on a whim. So I think that even if you do go through, those steps and planning processes that we talked about, if you get that tightrope balance right between business and sociological outcomes and sort of you've got it kind of working and humming along, all it takes is new leadership potentially in the organization to completely shake that tree and produce the kind of collision that Hugh talked about. So I think it's a very interesting challenge for us as professionals in this space, is how we, once we've, let's say we get it all right and it's all working the way we want it to be, how do we continue that conversation and continue to, demonstrate the business case for said community? How do we both be accountable to the business in terms of our own outcomes and metrics, but also interrogate assumptions and decisions and, feel comfortable enough to kind of throw up our hands and say, no, that's maybe not the right decision. I think I don't have a neat answer for that, but I think that that's a reality as community models mature and that more and more businesses move into the space, as we see the resurgence of own communities, at least coming back to cycle around yet again. I think that that's just an interesting function that we play within our respective organisations. Did you have any thoughts that you wanted to add, Ms. Jules?
No, not at this point. Yeah. It's been a good discussion. I like hearing the different, angles coming from people. So I guess I agree that, Scott was saying, if they want page views, then, that's the objective. But I was just thinking it's probably not an ideal objective to have if you want online community. So it's but we've sort of already discussed that full circle. So.
Yeah, well, I think that, I don't know about you guys, but I see this happening a lot when very passionate community managers or community builders really want to sell in the idea of community to their organisation, and they do go to some of the possible outcomes of that community, which can include things like time on site and SEO and all the rest of it, and those are very real, tangible benefits in certain instances. But I think that sometimes we're at risk of, confusing the forest for the trees if that becomes where the leadership focus is too prominently placed. Then invariably that collision Hugh described I think that's almost a certainty then. Whereas if you can be more nuanced perhaps in the sell-in and the discussion and make people understand that there's a collective objective that is a bit of a spectrum from things like time on site all the way through to how are we helping this group of people get what they actually need, and let's measure what they actually need and make that one of our success metrics. I think that it's important to consider that whole view if we're in a position to do so.
You made me think of something else that that organizations often wind up doing, and people still do this, and this is the community winds up being in a silo within the organization, and they're not connected to other parts of the organization, and so it becomes very hard to justify why community exists and how community benefits the organization. And so it's really important to build in those connections. One example that I'll give, the Best Buy community is super smart about the fact that they tied their sales data in with their community data, and so they're able to justify, or first of all, they're able to measure and see, and then justify the fact that the Best Buy community best exists as a pre-sales community. When people go in there before they bought anything, there's a higher chance that they're going to actually buy something from Best Buy than if they just came into the site and looked at reviews. And so it's important to try to tie your community success with the other parts of the business in a real concrete, we're trading metrics kind of way. Otherwise you wind up getting isolated and you just have these community metrics that don't tie into anything else, and that just further isolates what's going on.
Yeah, brilliant point. I think it promotes also, really sort of in a problematic way, that kind of marginalization that we see a lot of and continue to see a lot of, I suppose, with social media versus community, business versus community, different. There's I find a lot of little fringe pockets within our universe that are to a certain extent naturally going to occur, but I think that we silo ourselves even just because there's, you have your sociological kind of purists, and then you have your business purists, and then you have everyone in between. So I think that the more that we can be bridge builders, just the way that we do in our work within our industry, I think that's actually a really important piece that we can take ownership of. One other thing we didn't really touch on, we kind of mentioned, I suppose, was I think the risk and governance side of things. I think that it's often overlooked as well. I think that, and that's a delicate one, because invariably we don't want to put the fear of God into the people that we're trying to convince the community is a good thing and a good solution to the business problem at hand. We don't want to say, by the way, there are some risks in this model, and you're going to need a bit of a playbook to deal with those risks. But I think the best thing that we can do in that regard is to have the playbook, have done the thinking, have the plans, however dense they need to be for that community, for that organization. Obviously, if you're dealing with a large banking organization versus a small startup, you're probably going to have very different risk and governance playbooks and solutions and plans. But I think that that's a really key piece of work, so that you've just really got that to hand. When somebody says, but what about, you can say, yep, we've thought of that, it is a thing, and here's how it's handled, and give them that assurance that you as a community professional have done the work, and that there is definitely a way to model that and resource that, to Jessica's point. I know Hugh's done quite a lot of work with organisations on this piece. Did you have anything you wanted to add in there, Hugh?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think you've definitely hit it on the nail there around the fact that, risk is a major issue. Oops, I just kicked myself. Risk is a major issue for all businesses, and they're starting to realise, as more resources and more trust is put into these community platforms or these community channels, that they do need to address the question of risk as well. And sometimes it does freak people out, but then equally sometimes, and certainly a lot of my experience has been in the past, that the risk conversation is actually how you get them over the line. And really talking about the risk and going, well, we actually know what the risks are, and we know what they're likely to be, and we know how probable they are, and we know the impact of them if they occur. And here are the ways that we're actually, here are the things we've put in place to reduce, these risks or to mitigate the risks. Actually having that process and making it very much almost quite a formal process often is a very easy way to try and get, I guess, that decision over the line in saying, well, this is why we should go with this option. Is in being able to say, well, we have looked at the risks, and we have actually looked at these, and here are the ways that we've looked at how we're going to treat the risks and how we're going to manage the risks. So I think it can definitely really hurt your opportunity to try and get into social or get into community. but then equally it can also be an enabler. So it really depends on the individual organisation as to whether or not, you know, it's going to be something that will enable it or really kind of, you know, shoot it in the knees.
Or kick it in the knee, as you demonstrated.
Yeah, I have to say I agree with you too. So yeah, we do a lot of work with governance and risk and crisis planning for organisations as well, and it's about, you know, if you cover off all of that, and that's a core part of what we do with every client, you cover off the risks, you have a response plan in place, you have some draft responses, so you're not waiting for someone to sign off before you can say something if you get to that point where, you know, it's 48 hours and nobody's responded. So that's almost like your reactive piece, you know, and then you win the confidence of the organisation or the people that you're dealing with, so that you're able to do the more proactive, engaging things, the actual, you know, dealing with the people in the community.
Definitely. I think that's an enabler to the autonomy that Jess was talking about. I think I've seen more times than I'd like to count, organisations hire amazingly talented community builders and community strategists, and then not really deliberately, but basically ignore them. And then they sit in the corner doing their thing and become that silo that Scott was talking about. And I think that is part of that piece, is you've kind of got to show that piece has been done, and it'll just, you know, it'll clear your obstacles more effectively and more quickly. We've got actually a question from Twitter from EdTech Stories is interested in the idea of, you know, to what extent are great communities a result of great products, you know, postulating that, you know, people won't necessarily hang around if the product is poor. So what do you guys have to say about that? Do you think how much is product, whether it's a ephemeral product or a tangible product, tied up into the success of a community?
I'll take this one. I think the first part of that is, yeah, having an amazing product definitely helps create an awesome community, but it's by far not the only. And a great example of that is Apple. If you look at Apple's support forums and you look at their forums, obviously that's a tangible thing of having a product that people evangelize, and that's obviously amazing. However, I don't think, because when you look back at startups and you look back at really, really early communities, you don't necessarily have to have an amazing product right away to be able to create a great community. What creates a great community is showing that you both care and listen to your community members. So whether you have a community of 20 people at the very beginning, or you have a community of 500,000 or whatever it is, showing that you care and that you're listening and that you loop in, speaking to what everyone says about making sure community isn't a silo, where you loop into different departments, whether that's support or product or development or your sales team, and looping them in and showing that here's what community does for their particular site, for what they particularly care about, and then being able to communicate that back to customers, being able to communicate back to your customers and community members that, yeah, we are listening, we do care about you, and we do value you, and your contributions to the community is what's going to sustain a great community.
So I'll jump in real quick and just say that Apple support forums are a great example of what I think is the community is a really solid community, but Apple has consistently undermined the community because they're so tight with information. They don't give information, or I know I experience this because I now am starting to own Apple products. It's kind of hard not to, but you find the community, you'll find your problem on the community, multiple discussions, the community is wrapping around the issue, or they're agreeing with it, or they're trying their best to help out, but ultimately it's a problem with Apple, and Apple should be addressing it, and then Apple doesn't address it. And the community can only sustain your products so far.
I think that, yeah.
Sorry,
that's true. I have to say, I think that a great community is never built around a product. Like, the product might be what's funding the community, but it's always about, like Jessica was saying, it's about the people. Like, that's what community is. Without people, you don't have a community, but you can still have a product. It's about, you know, what are the benefits? What are people getting out of this product? Like, what makes them want to join a community? And like interact with each other.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily think that you can particularly separate, product and community in terms of like someone like Apple, where obviously, it is very much about, yes, perhaps the culture around the product, but ultimately a lot of those sort of more customer support oriented communities are very much about product. But I think the bigger question here is, and I think the good question that was raised by by EdTech Stories was the question of, can community make a bad product good? And I think the resounding answer is no. If it's a crap product, it's not going to get, you're not going to produce some community that will then, hockey stick your way into, Silicon Valley success. You need to actually have, the basics there first. You need to actually deliver on what you're promising as a brand before you can really actually see, I guess, the enabler. Alternatively, you could just deliver a really bad product and generate a community of people that hate your product, but I don't really understand how that would particularly fit into, the overall strategy.
You could start with some
I think
ideas to improve the product.
Good. Sorry, Jules.
I was just going to say, like, you could start with a crap product and start an idea generation. People to vote on ideas and actually listen to them. Maybe you could improve the product and make it worthwhile.
Well, that is the perpetual beta.
That's going to be my point too. I was just going to say, I don't think it can make a bad product good, but it could potentially be definitely a bit of an incubator for making the product better, providing the product owners and creators have an ear to the ground and are prepared to action that feedback, of course. Sorry, Scott, did we cut you off?
No, I was just going to say that's the perpetual beta model that we saw all through the 2000s, right? You throw out a product, and then we're seeing it now. You throw out half a product, you get feedback on it, you decide whether you're going to improve it or pivot it. Anyway, yeah.
But and I think it's really interesting to see the way that impacts business models. And so one of the people I was talking to a little while ago, sort of separately in a social environment, as in a actual social face-to-face over drinks environment, just to be very specific, but was talking about how the organisation that he works for had just launched a consumer product, and there'd normally sort of been more, I guess, business-to-business products that were then used by consumers. And the thing that was really confusing is I was like, oh, that sounds like a perfect candidate for, like a Kickstarter model, generate some actual groundswell, generate some buzz around the product and actual conversations around, hey, here's this kind of version 1 prototype, we want you to come in early, play around with it, tell us about it and everything else. And I said, it's just the perfect model for that, you've just got the perfect product. And he went, oh, but we don't need that. We don't need money from Kickstarter. We've got billions of dollars in the bank. What does it matter? And it was this really interesting difference between, I guess, the way that traditional old school business approaches, product development in this age of community, and in this age of it being very easy to do that, compared to, the way that I immediately went, oh, that would just be a perfect product to get into that sort of early group of early adopters, get it into their hands and get that early feedback to improve the product.
Perfect product, not necessarily the perfect people to have a community.
Yes, very nice segue back. So one other thing we wanted to talk about today was how you can basically stress test your community. So let's say you've done it, you've built a community, or you're on the journey to building a community and slowly building and growing and extending that community. Your business is on board, or your organization's on board for now at least. How do you start to think about the things that are going to definitely come flying at you at some point? So either rapid growth, let's say the marketing department goes and does a marketing campaign and it's a wild success and suddenly you go from 500 to 500,000 members overnight. How do you prepare for that? How do you even start to think about what that projected journey can look like in the inception stage of community? What sort of techniques and tactics have you guys used over the years to actually stress test your community for things like rapid growth, for crisis, for change management as well, which is inevitable?
Who wants to go first? Look, I mean, I think that some of those things really are, there's only so much you can prepare for, and certainly I think in the context of how you might test a community around a crisis is really, I mean, in the same way of when you ask about, how to prepare someone for a crisis, there's only so much sort of, practice and, all of those kinds of things that you can do without actually going, well, you learn the things when you fall into the deep end. And I think in sometimes, when we talk about in that sense of in communities about how it's often that those crises and those situations when people really, you can see the community rallying together around that particular cause can actually really be a strengthening force. But then equally, I'm not sure, and I'm interested to hear the other people's thoughts, I'm not sure how well you could necessarily kind of plan to prepare for that and whether that's really possible. So I'm interested in what other people think.
Well, so real quick, since I just got out of the panel on change management, and crisis management is kind of the sudden change management. So I'd say that's an interesting question. The idea of stress testing a community is an interesting idea because they're living. It's a living set of relationships. They're humans. They're people, and so I think there's a certain kind of stress testing that I would be very uncomfortable attempting. On the other hand, planning. I think this is where the key is. Trying to anticipate and just give yourself. It's the idea of giving yourself breathing room in case something happens. And I would say in one case, as soon as you start getting people together in your community, building trusted allies within your community, just people who you can trust with. Here's some information. Here's what's going on with the day. Here's what's going on with the organization, the product, whatever it's going to be. Not necessarily insider information, but just I'm sharing this with you before I share it with anybody else. So when those moments of crises occur, you're not alone in, we've had rapid growth, and now there's fights breaking out because marketing went out and brought in a whole lot of people who really aren't the target, or they got a wider group of people. Now you have a trusted group of people you can go to and say, hey, we need to hang on to the core community values, or we need to make sure that people are being taught they're being integrated into the community as they come in. So that can help you. So it's a lot of, I think it's planning and preparing and always expecting the worst.
Yeah, I have to agree
what
with
about you, Jules?
a lot of that. Yeah, I think it's really important that, you maintain a flexible approach. I mean, these are people you're dealing with, like Scott says, and we've already said a few times, but also keep an eye on, look at your back end, look at your analytics and understand what your audience is doing and what they might do, so it's like constantly keeping across that and identifying risks along the way. So don't just do your one governance piece before you launch and then forget about it. Always be reviewing that, like it should be a constant process. And also the other thing that we've already talked about, but to be a strong influence within your organisation. I mean, we have to be assertive as community managers. We have to push back a lot. And that's whether you're in-house or at an agency or a consultant, whatever sort of capacity you're working in. You've got to do what you can to make yourself heard. And although we don't wish a crisis on anyone, sometimes it can be the best thing to happen to make an organisation listen. Sometimes it's the only way. You can communicate as much as possible. You can put your reports in. You can say that, these are our objectives and this is how we're going to meet them, and yes, we're performing, but sometimes there are other roadblocks within an organisation that people don't sit up and listen until they absolutely have to. And unfortunately, at least then you have the plans in place when that sort of thing does happen, that you know how to manage it.
So I want to add, I just had the thought, I can't believe I forgot about this. Actually, there is a way of stress testing live communities for growth and usage. You can have an event, make it a small event, make it a party, make it the whole purpose of the party is to stuff it or to crowd in. I've done it in virtual worlds where we were doing some kind of event. and we anticipated a large number of people, but we had no idea how much the servers could technically handle, and so we would get complaints, and I have long apologies about breaking things by doing this, but because it was an event, it didn't break the whole community. In another, we were in another community. I had a we had a tiny little feature that we were launching, and I wanted to try to stress test that particular feature, and so set up a specific period of time, said, hey everyone, let's all crowd in during these next 2 hours, and just, I have no idea what will happen. It might break, but let's see if we can actually cause something. So now you're doing it on purpose. So you've drawn parameters around it, you've drawn a border around it, and it's not dangerous, it's not getting in the way. You're not going to disrupt what the community is trying to do. You've carved a special space. So there you go. There's one.
Great. That's a fabulous template, yeah, to quarantine it off like that. Jess, what are your thoughts on this one?
Just to add on to both Jules and Scott's points, those are both awesome points, and I just add to it, there's a lot of planning and there's a lot of things that you can do to like make sure that you're ready for if there is a crisis, but it ultimately comes down to having the right systems and the right trust in place to be able to be flexible. Like you're not going to be able to prepare for, you can probably prepare for 99% of the things that are going to be thrown your way, but you're always going to get thrown that curveball at some point in time, and having the flexibility to be able to adapt on the fly is a hugely valuable trait for a community manager. And having the ability and having the trust within your organization to be able to be flexible when a curveball gets thrown your way.
I think that's a lovely point to close on, actually, is that, you know, we'll recognize and know from experience that it takes an awful lot of planning, resourcing, thinking to map out the journey to community, to make sure it's the right journey, to be able to sort of be agile and support it through changes, peaks and troughs along the way. Probably the most critical investment internally and within your organization and within the community is that social capital and that trust, because without it, you know, no world-class social media crisis playbook will save you if nobody's really going to fundamentally listen to you, or if, as Jules said, if you're not actually able to action the influence within your organization or within the community itself. If you can be trying to do your best work, but yeah, you need that trust in place, and that's sort of that slow earned work over time. So that's probably a really lovely way to close. Kind of run out of time. Hopefully anyone listening has gotten some ideas about processes and systems, some steps that they can go through when they're thinking about maybe building a community. I think that this is going to become more and more relevant. That's why I thought it'd be a really good topic for the chat today. Thank you, each and every one of you, for your amazing insights. Did anybody have any kind of tweet-worthy closing thoughts they wanted to add?
No.
Yeah. ...
No tweetable quotes. Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you guys so much for everybody watching. We have actually 2 more panels for the night. Head on over to cman.co. Click on the broadcast schedule. First of all, you can watch anything. You can watch reruns of today if you missed anything. Otherwise, click on Round the Clock Community and Social Media Management, and we'll see you guys in about 5 minutes. Bye.
Bye. See you guys.